Okay, today I'm interviewing Bruce Teakle. He's Australia's most experienced maternity consumer representative, and he's going to be talking to us about the National Maternity Services Plan. Welcome, Bruce.
Thanks, Alicia. Good morning, everyone. I just want to talk about birth reform politics and consumer representation. First, I should introduce myself. I've got a slide of myself and my family, which is actually a few years old, which is very flattering for us all, except for the children who are bigger now. And this next slide is just showing my own experience of birth. That's the birth of our last child here at home, and so my personal experience of birth has been overwhelmingly positive, and I'm very conscious of how women's and families' experience of birth care shapes their identities as parents and families, and really has a really big influence on people's lives and society, and that's why all this matters to me. As an overview of what I want to talk about, I'm starting off with the assumption that women need better care in maternity care. I don't think we've got any argument about that, so I won't dwell on that too much. The next main point is that birth occurs in the political environment. The sort of choices women have and the experiences women have are really driven by political factors more than economic or clinical factors, which is what some people would argue. It's a very cultural and political determinant. Consumers have driven reform in maternity services in Australia. The reason that anything's got better in maternity care has been because of consumer activism and consumer representation, and I think it's really important that consumers continue to engage in maternity services and hopefully ramp it up, really. One of the key asks from consumers is for midwifery continuity of care, and that sort of primary care model where each woman has a midwife that she knows and trusts and has a high degree of continuity of care with her throughout her maternity care episode, that's fundamental to being able to deliver reform. So other choices that women might want about how the care is, for example, water immersion in labour, you can't deliver those things without continuity of care. And so the conclusion is we need active consumers representing women and families and pushing it hospital and government levels. So what do women want? Informed choice is a really common mantra of the consumer movement in maternity care all around the world. Informed choice is actually two quite different ideas brought together. The informed part is about informing women with evidence-based information, not just the opinion of someone who's telling women what they have to do, which is too often women's experience. And the choice bit is about the woman being able to make decisions about her care and empowering the woman. Again, it's very hard to do that without continuity of care. It's very hard to do that without information. And it's very hard to do that without a culture of care that pays attention to women and what they want. Now, models of care, that's actually a fairly radical idea in some places, that the model of care, the way in which care is delivered to a woman, makes a really big difference to her experience, and it makes a big difference to her outcome. A lot of healthcare assumes that whatever happens to a woman in her maternity care is just about the woman's body, and it was all going to happen anyway. So the caesarean rate is often argued, that's just because women's bodies aren't able to push their babies out. But the evidence shows that the way that care is delivered makes a big difference. So continuity of carer is really, I keep saying that, central to an effective model of care, so that the care is based around a relationship between the woman and her carer, of familiarity in both ways, where conversations about what a woman's choices are had before birth. It's very hard to make choices during labour for a woman who's got a lot of more important things to be doing than answering questions. And models of care is also about universality and accessibility. So do we want choice to be something that you only have if you can afford it? Or is it something that should be fundamental to the whole system of care? So consumers have strongly pushed that all birthing women should have access to good quality care, continuity of carer, and accessibility, having services based in the community and able to be got to by women without it being a stressful thing. Community-based services have many attributes that really work for consumers. So consumer representation, women want to be represented in the services, and that's the way they're going to get things to change. Consumer groups as stakeholders. So that's a really important idea. It's a new idea. When I got involved in maternity reform politics, consumers weren't recognised as a stakeholder in the decision-making process by government or by hospitals. And it's still a struggle, particularly at the hospital level, to get the decision makers, the people who determine what sort of care women get and what sort of options women have, for them to recognise that consumers, or the people who represent women, should have a say in that. So the solution to that is to have consumer representation at all levels of decision making, from the health minister, the health departments in the states and Commonwealth, and at the hospital, that local service level. You've got to have both ends. You've got to have ministers who understand what consumers want and are pushing the hospitals, and you've also got to have women engaged with hospitals so that they do what they've got to do. So what's the evidence? This is really important to the conversation with both politicians and hospitals, and it's really important foundation for women's confidence when they're representing women to the maternity care system. So to focus on midwifery continuity of carer, which isn't the only issue, but it's a really central one. There's really strong evidence that midwifery continuity of care improves outcomes for women. And that's clinical outcomes, but also in the way women feel about their care. And there'd be so many other things that could be measured that haven't been about the long-term outcomes for women and families. So more than 17,000 women who've been part of 15 randomised controlled trials, which is a really high quality way of doing science, show better outcomes in all clinical measures. That's pretty amazing. It's not like there's a trade-off that you have to make, which is often claimed. Now, this will be claimed at the hospital level all the time, that doctors feel like, well, letting a midwife run the care, make decisions, have autonomy about how care is provided, letting go of medical control, we're going to lose safety. Well, you don't. The evidence is really clear that when you have continuity of primary care by a midwife, you get better outcomes in everything. Now, the best evidence for this is what's known as the Cochrane Review. So there's the Cochrane Library, which I think is still free for Australians to access over the internet, but I can't remember quite how. The Cochrane Library is the gold standard source of reviews of evidence-based practice in all of healthcare. So there's Cochrane reviews on all sorts of questions in healthcare, including maternity care. And there's a Cochrane review of the evidence on midwife-led care, which was most recently updated in 2015. And that looks through all the really high-quality scientific evidence about midwife-led care. Cochrane reviews aren't research themselves, aren't clinical research, they're reviews of published evidence. And so they've looked at all these high-quality randomised controlled trials, and they review the overall outcome. And it's very much worth Googling Cochrane review midwife-led care and having a look at what you can get the abstract really easily, and that will show you what the evidence is that supports midwife-led care, which, as I said earlier, is to a large extent the gateway to giving women really good choices and control over their care. So the next slide shows you what women have to do to get the evidence to be paid attention to. The birth reform movement has had to get the hang of the fact that governments and health services don't use the evidence in deciding models of care. That's absolutely true. Evidence or cost are not drivers of the sort of services we get. So don't let anyone tell you, don't believe anyone arguing that they are. This is a lovely little show of pregnant women in an inflatable pool protesting against the loss of the baths at the Royal Brisbane Hospital in 2005, I think. And my own wife is on the left there with our last baby in her belly. So that little bit of history, let's go from there to have a look at the history of where this whole movement came, which I think is a really important perspective on maternity reform politics. So it's only 100 years or so since women were protesting for the right to vote. And along with the right to vote, these same women were advocating that women should be able to do other sort of extreme activities like divorce abusive husbands or own property or inherit property. Birth politics is a feminist issue, and within that is the gender power struggle between the most feminine profession of midwifery and the most masculine profession of medicine. So it's worth remembering the history behind women advocating for their rights. So I'll take you back to where I got involved in the birth reform movement was at the end of 2001. Now, in 2001, a lot of attention came on the question of birth care because it looked like home birth, an unusual but sort of a keystone option in birth care, was about to disappear. The midwives who provide home birth care lost access to professional indemnity insurance in 2001, and it looked like it could be the end of their ability to practice, work in private practice. At the same time, there was a growing public consciousness of the caesarean epidemic. Now, in those days, it was only 26%, and we were banging on about how outrageous that was. It's gone up to 34% in Australia since then. So there's been a very steep rise in the rate of caesareans in Australia. And I think that's a pretty good indication of how poorly the healthcare system supports women's ability to push their own babies out. And again, I think we point to the model of care rather than it being something wrong with women. Cost. So increasing caesarean rates up to a third of births is a massively expensive exercise. The cost of a caesarean is several times that of a normal birth. And caesareans are associated with a whole lot of other healthcare costs, long hospital stays, and long-term health impacts. It's great when you can have a caesarean when you need it, but if you're having a high rate like that, then it's really a problem. Carers leaving the sinking ship. There's been a sort of periodic concern in the media and in the professions about how disengaged midwives and even obstetricians are from their professions. In 2001, there was also a medical professional indemnity insurance crisis brewing, and so obstetrics was the biggest focal point of the medical indemnity insurance problem, which has since been dealt with. Rural closures. Women who live in the bush know how difficult it is to get community-based maternity care, and how much it matters to a small town that people can be born in their own local hospital or somewhere else locally. And all this led to a lot of consumer frustration and a lot of questioning about what consumer groups, women could do about the maternity care system. So how do you turn all these circumstances into a movement that wants to reform maternity care? You've got a lot of really valuable ingredients here to put together. You've got the evidence, as I described, that supports better models of care. Australia is really lucky having midwives from Britain, New Zealand, and a smaller number of midwives from places like Netherlands and other European places where midwifery care is just normal and has always been normal. You've got consumers with experience of other models. Women who've come from New Zealand get pregnant in Australia, find out what their options are and say, is this it? Is this the best you can do? It's a real life home recording. There's a long history in Australia of an alternative birth care. That's really particularly focused on home birth. But birth centres have been another element in that. So there's a number of local birth centres around Australia that exist particularly because local women have really pushed for them, and then those birth centres have survived because women have pushed really hard to keep those models going. Crisis is always good for getting problems addressed, and 2001 was a crisis for home birth. And if you can find individuals offering leadership and vision, and you've also got the benefit of living in the age of internet communication, then sometimes you can pull something together. So at the end of 2001, some visionary Australian consumer reps put together a vision called the National Maternity Action Plan, the NMAP. It's almost forgotten. You can find it online somewhere, I think. But in 2002, this was launched all around Australia and led to a lot of work pushing state and Commonwealth governments to do something about it. Maternity Coalition owned the document and brought a whole lot of other stakeholder organisations, particularly in midwifery, together to push for this new way of doing services, and called it community midwifery. And we worked really hard on that. So the National Maternity Action Plan, or we called the NMAP, focused on continuity of care, or one-to-one care, or caseload care, or it's often called MGP models. it was proposed to be an option for all women, not just lucky enough to have a birth centre, not just able to afford a private midwife for a home birth, not just lucky enough to have a supportive hospital. It really focused on care based in the community. So clinics, homes, rather than being sort of completely hospital based, really pushed the idea of care being shaped around informed choice, including where babies are given born. So that includes questions about home birth and also about small town births, where women want to be able to make choices as to what risks they want to take. Make sure that care is integrated with state services and public hospitals, and that it's funded in such a way that all women have the option. And this is what it looked like. Here's a few photos from that campaign in 2002 and onwards, where a lot of work was done to promote this vision around Australia. Here's Charlotte Street in Brisbane, outside the Queensland Health Building, where that was quite a few years before the women were sitting there in the inflatable pools. And here's a lovely gang of women, I think in, where was this, Alicia? Was this Cunnamulla? Who got together under a fig tree in the local park protesting about the loss of the local maternity services. And they were really unhappy about the time they had to spend away from their families, waiting to go into labour in another town, having to deal with other kids.
Out
west. And this was a bunch of women who organised this completely without any involvement from consumer groups. This was just a totally local thing. And here's some of those suffragettes that have come out again. Here they are in King George Square in Brisbane. Bunch of women and midwives dressed up as suffragettes. And this was the year that was the centenary of women's suffrage in Queensland. So it's 100 years after women first got the vote in Queensland. That's one of the first places in the world. So there they are promoting better maternity services. We had to meet with a lot of politicians. Anna Bligh was very supportive. There's some old faces who've left politics, some who haven't. And this work in Queensland, the activism supporting the National Maternity Action Plan actually had a really positive state response, and we had an election promise in the 2004 state election for a review of maternity services. And that was a pretty big effort. Travelled around the state, looked at models around the country, had an expert panel including consumer representatives, and they developed a report called Rebirthing, which I don't know, I hope it's still available online. But that Rebirthing became the sort of the government, set the government direction for maternity services in Queensland for several years. Again, recognising consumers as stakeholders and putting some really key things in to build midwifery capability in the healthcare system here.
How about in other states, Bruce? Was there similar commitment?
Other states have had reviews and reports. New South Wales recently had, I think it was it a 10-year or 20, I can't remember how long, but there was a Shearman report, I think, in New South Wales. I can't remember the name of the review in Victoria, but there is quite a collection of reviews of maternity services around Australia, state and Commonwealth, that all are consistent with, in their recommendations, they're all consistent with what consumers want. And it does focus on midwifery, primary care, continuity of care, and recognising women's right to choice. the result at the Commonwealth level came in 2009. So we all remember the Kevin 07 election in 2007. The new health minister was Nicola Roxon, who's a very strong character who was willing to take on some big reforms. This happened at the same time as another really major, well, a much bigger reform to the whole healthcare system, which was the introduction of national registration, where doctors, nurses, midwives, all the health professions are now registered at the national level instead of by a whole swarm of state-based health practitioner regulators. But in 2008, there was a review of maternity services set up by the Commonwealth. And that gave a report that's still available, that I can't remember the name of it, but it's the Maternity Services Review report. And that, again, that pointed towards women's rights to choice, the benefits of midwifery care, community-based care, and it laid the way for the government to take a really strong step in reform in the May 2009 budget and put $120 million up to bring in a whole set of reforms. Now, the key element, well, we'll go into the next slide, but yeah, there was Medicare reforms, professional indemnity insurance reforms, and some legislative changes to make sure that home birth was able to survive despite a set of problems. But that's another story. So in the budget in 2009, that $120 million brought in Medicare payments and pharmaceutical benefit schemes, that means subsidised drugs, for eligible midwives. So a type of midwife was created called the eligible midwife, who's got enough experience across the scope of practice to be able to get a notation on her registration. And once she's got that, she can have a Medicare provider number and prescribe a certain set of drugs for her clients. And she's also able to get Commonwealth subsidised professional indemnity insurance, which was a key problem, which things couldn't progress without that. And there was a few other things, including the National Maternity Services Plan. Now, the National Maternity Services Plan is where all the states and territories agreed to put things in place to support these Commonwealth reforms, which they haven't done, and we'll get back onto that in a minute. So, professional indemnity insurance for midwives and Medicare both started in 2010. So since then, there's been a whole set of Medicare rebates that a woman can get paid as partial compensation for employing a midwife to provide antenatal care in the community, labour and birth care only in hospital, unfortunately, and postnatal care in the community. So there's now a flow of government money that follows the women's choices if they can find an eligible midwife. There's a whole bunch of eligible midwives. I think there's about 300 eligible midwives in Australia. Most of them are in Queensland, which is the only state that has really taken on implementation of this eligible midwife reforms because of an activist midwifery and activist consumer culture that's been very strong here, keeping the state government rolling on it.
Just sorry to interrupt, Bruce. What other states? So Queensland's leading the way. Who I guess would you say might be second or third?
There's a bit of a race starting to develop, I'm pleased to say, for those places. Western Australia has a handful of midwives credentialed to public hospitals over there. I don't think there has been a from last I've heard, unless something's changed in the last couple of weeks, I'm not aware that there's been a private birth in a public hospital with a private midwife yet, because they've got some restrictions about which women can have that sort of care. But there's a strong political commitment to progress in Western Australia. There's a very strong support from the Health Minister there. So we're expecting to see progress there. South Australia has, I think it's 2 or 3 midwives credentialed under very unsatisfactory arrangements, having to find a private obstetrician to support them in a public hospital. It's not working well there. They really need to dramatically change their policy to get that happening. Victoria has an election promise which is being slowly implemented to get 1 or 2 pilot hospitals, and I believe there's 1 hospital in Victoria that has 5 midwives credentialed for access there. So for these things to work, these private midwives have to be eligible, and they have to have access to the hospital. So there's a whole process of credentialing and signing up a contract between the midwife and the hospital that needs a supportive hospital culture, and you get that when women get involved. So this is just a quick rundown through what an eligible midwife is, which we don't have to go into, and that is actually changing. So where are we now, which is what Alicia's asking really. Primary midwifery care, primary maternity care. Primary care is the first sort of healthcare you get on anything. If you've got a bleeding nose, you go to a GP, not a medical specialist. If you're pregnant, you go to a midwife, not an obstetrician. That's how most of the world does it, and it's the most effective way to deliver care. So eligible midwives need access to public hospitals, which they have in 8 hospitals in Queensland and 1 or 2 others in other states, and they need other supports. We've got the National Maternity Services Plan, in which all the states undertook to give access to these midwives, these eligible midwives, to their public hospitals. And as you've heard, most hospitals around the country in most states haven't done it. And again, mostly because there hasn't been the organised voice of women banging on the health minister's door or hassling their local hospitals. We have a problem where home birth is truly at risk at the end of this year, 2016, because of unresolved problems with professional indemnity insurance. There is no PII that covers home birth, and the requirement for health practitioners to have PII for all of their care has been exempted for midwives providing home birth, but that exemption is about to expire and we don't have a plan. And then there's public continuity models, which is where public hospitals set up, without the involvement of any private midwives, a model of care such as a midwifery group practice or caseload care or whatever name it's called, where we have one midwifery care, that's entirely public hospital owned and free to women. So that's another area that needs a lot of consumer pressure and has been a really hard row to hoe. So what do we need to do? And I'm really just repeating myself again. We need consumer representation at hospitals and politicians. If I say it 3 times, maybe it gets...
Yeah, I think if we hear it enough, it'll sink in.
You've got to have women banging on doors, getting themselves on committees, or just being known as a nuisance by hospital management. And some women are really good at this, just taking this up and expecting to be recognised as a stakeholder. And women should be. They should be the #1 stakeholder. We need governments and hospitals to include consumers in decision making. We need access to public hospitals for products, as all the states and territories undertook. And we need more public models where the midwives employed by hospitals work in a more continuity of care model. Now, to get all this stuff to happen, we need consumer reps. And we need to support consumer reps with training and then ongoing support through networking and whatever they need. So, to the audience we have today, what can hypnobirthing practitioners do? Well, think politically. Start imagining what can be done in your context and seeing as well as focusing on the woman and her needs, thinking about the system in which she gives care. Develop networks that are local, within the state and nationally. And what I always say to midwives is spot the talent. Find the women who you can see who might be that woman who can bang on a door and go and represent women. Connect women with the consumer movement, and Alicia's our expert in that. She's a leader in the maternity consumer movement. And hypnobirthing practitioners themselves can engage with hospitals and members of parliament. Going to see a member of parliament is a really useful thing to do, and it's usually great fun. So talk to members of parliament about this stuff. There's a photo of the front steps of the midwifery practice. I think they provided a bit of help for you, did they, Alicia? In Toowoomba, this is a house in Margaret Street, Toowoomba, which is a private midwifery practice, and it's just a delightful way to deliver healthcare.
Yeah, I had two of my children through my midwives in Toowoomba. I was pretty lucky, actually. My mum saw the ad in the paper, otherwise I wouldn't have known about it.
Well, that's really good. We're all really lucky your mum saw the ad.
Lucky too, because the midwife I had then started me on my consumer rep journey. So it's funny how all those things have joined together, and that's why I'm here now.
Yeah, we're very lucky. So that's really the end. I don't know if there's some way of us fielding questions now. Anything else to tie that up?
I guess, thank you, Bruce. I guess a few questions, putting my practitioner hat on, not necessarily consumer hat. Thinking from a practitioner point of view, okay, so we've got practitioners who are spotting talent, even, maybe who are consumers themselves and are interested in going to their local member. I guess, where do you see home birth going, or what can we do? Because it's certainly an option. We know that it's just as safe to birth at home for low-risk women as in a hospital. What can we do, or what do you think is going to happen towards the end of this year when if this exemption isn't extended, or what can we do to put pressure on the powers to be, or who do we talk to make sure that it is extended?
That's really important question. What do we do about to maintain the option of home birth? And home birth is more than just an experience for a family, and it's a really important experience for the families who do choose it, but it represents a lot about women's right to make choices, that a woman doesn't have to take whatever's being given her by her local services. It's symbolically really important, and a lot of the reforms that have happened in public maternity services have come out of home birth care, even though that might not always be recognised. So I think that the most important thing to do about the exemption, the expiry of the exemption is what's going to drive the loss of home birth if that happens at the end of 2016. And state and Commonwealth governments are all tied up in that exemption. That exemption is a decision made by, it's legislated by state governments, but it tends to be coordinated by the Commonwealth government. And at the moment, there is no cultural support for home birth at the Commonwealth level. There's no commitment to do anything to maintain it as an option. The only way it's going to be kept is by women and families going to state and Commonwealth members of Parliament and saying, I want you to do something about this problem. How are you going to ensure that home birth is an option for me, my sisters, my daughters, after the end of this year? So as I said, it's a state government issue because the exemption is legislated by the state, so don't let them tell you that it's not a state issue. And the Commonwealth plays a really big role in coordinating all the states. The exemption that has maintained access to home birth for the last 5 years was arranged by the Commonwealth Health Minister, who got the states to do it. So don't let anyone tell you it's not their level of government's business. And just going to see members of Parliament and then going to see them again and then going to see them again and making sure they realise you're not going to go away is the only way we're going to get this to happen. In 2010, when this was a risk, we had an incredible scene in Parliament when there was a rally about this, with all sorts of members of Parliament queuing up to pledge their support for home birth. And that is purely because they didn't want to be seen as cutting off women's rights or the rights of women in their constituencies. They felt politically vulnerable, so they did something about it.
I guess, again, wearing my hypnobirth practitioner hat, we have a lot of parents that tell us that perhaps they're not allowed. So, and I guess this is it is political, but also where the law comes in as well. So, I'm not, my doctor won't allow me to go past 40 weeks of pregnancy, or I'm not allowed to refuse a gestational diabetes test or things like that. I guess, what's your insight, Bruce? Because things like this have been happening for a long time.
Yeah, so not allowed. The law is really clear that the baby is part of the woman's body until it's born. And the woman has the right in law to make decisions about her own body. And if that's not being respected, it's really hard to do anything about it. There is a consumer movement that's really focused on women's legal rights in childbirth. I can't remember the name of that group, but I'm sure a bit of Googling would find that group if that's an issue for you. But I think approaching these conversations with real clarity that it's a woman's right to make choices about her own body, it really helps. But it's really, really hard to deliver informed choice, like I said at the beginning, without continuity of care. Try and get continuity of care. You can't trust an institution. The institution's made up of a whole bunch of people, each of whom has their own ideas. And there are so many stories of women making deals with hospitals about their choices and then turning up in labour and the people they made the deals with aren't there. So try and find a way of getting continuity of care, employing a private midwife, even if she doesn't have credentialing and access to the hospital. So you've got someone who knows how things work, who's there working for you, not working for someone else. That's the best I can offer.
Okay. I guess another thing that practitioners might like to know about, it's getting more difficult to access home birth, not just because of the exemption, but because of the new regulations around that some practitioners mightn't be aware of, around having to have not just a midwife, but now soon it will be 2 midwives, that they have to be not just registered but endorsed. I guess, what do you think about that, given that we know there's so few endorsed midwives, that it's really going to take away services for women perhaps in rural areas or that have trouble accessing an endorsed midwife, let alone 2 for a home birth?
Yeah, that's a real problem, particularly right now. I don't know what the short-term solution will be. It'll be interesting to see how the Nursing Board, Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia responds to feedback about that. I think the ideal solution, so definitely it is a problem. It's going to make it harder for women to access home birth care in many places, particularly, as you say, in rural areas. In there are so many short-term problems that I can't see good solutions to. What I would like to see as the long-term solution is that you get a full set of supports for continuity of midwifery care. So the funding system's fixed up, the access to hospitals fixed up. You have a whole framework of support for community-based midwifery care so that midwives don't have to practice in isolation, so that midwives have lots of support working with colleagues, that it's not, so many women are having birth care from a midwife who's travelling hundreds or thousands of kilometres to cover a big area. That's really hard on those midwives, it's really hard on those women. And what it really illustrates is how little support there is for that sort of care. We really need to have a whole system, reform of the whole system, so that midwives practicing in the community, practicing with other midwives, have plenty of work, plenty of support, and not working in a hostile environment.
Yeah, and I guess how little or how poor of an uptake the National Maternity Services Plan really has been. There's been some improvement, but when you look at the situation we're in now, it really is evident that not all states are on board with the National Maternity Services Plan.
Absolutely, that's been a really bad policy failure where states haven't, they've signed up to the National Maternity Services Plan where they explicitly said that they would give eligible midwives access to public hospitals, and they didn't. Now, sadly, the reality in politics is that politicians and governments don't do stuff, even if they say they're going to, they're not going to do it unless there's a political dividend for them. So the dividend is either getting praised or not getting their asses kicked, sort of the same thing. So if state governments have said they're going to do something, they need that to be followed up by their constituents. They need women banging on their doors, requiring that they do it. And they haven't had that in too many places. We really need a strong and effective consumer movement supporting women to make it hard. When you look at those rallies and things we did in the early 2000s, it was a lot of work, but that created the political capital that lasted us for years, because health ministers didn't want to have a rally of women and midwives pushing prams through the King George Square. You've got to make political costs for it.
Okay, I think that's all my questions. Anything else to add that it's a topic you could go for hours on, really.
That's right. I think it's enough of everyone's time used already, but thanks very much, Alicia.
Thank you for joining us. Okay.